the strongest things that I've been asked through the course of this is how can we work together better? And this has just come up in that it's been offered for names to be collated and networking. Now, people all have different backgrounds of expertise, and all that expertise is being wasted because people feel a bit isolated in their communities. So I think this idea of networking is really excellent. There's already some things like Facebook groups for people to coalesce, and it would be, I would offer for everyone can join FIRE. That means I have a record of all of you, because if I make a call to action, I may not have access to those groups, so it's worth you depositing your contact information there if you want to be known. But also, yes, network with people that are like-minded in terms of their objectives and what they're trying to achieve. One of the things I put right at the beginning was just one of the last slides I showed, and the reason I want to do this is I'm just going to read these out because I'm asking this panel. I didn't prepare them for this, so I want an honest answer from them. For having all these 5 points together, current safety guidelines are not safe. Serious biological disruption is occurring at low intensities. Negative health effects are occurring widely in the community already. The scientific evidence of harm is now indisputable. And to deploy 5G is a contradiction of the things that follows on the next slide. Can you raise your hand in the panel if you're comfortable that you agree with those points?
Yeah, of course.
So I'm always conscious that, as a group, we don't always agree on everything. Of course we don't. That's really healthy. And there'll be questions raised where one person will give one answer and the other will not. And opposition is what science is all about. It's really important. But the reason I put those 5 points down is because we need to find our common ground. If we're going to unite and work together, we all need to do that in all of these different areas. And there are some broad brush principles where we all agree, even though there may be disputes on some of the finer points. Anyway,
mention one thing. In Germany, we will bring out the medical guidelines for environmental medicine, and we will publish this in November. I'm just correcting the last part. So we will do this from diagnosis and therapy, environmental medicine, clinical environmental medicine. We are going to do the guidelines to prove the evidence.
sounds excellent. So one of the questions was, regarding public health diseases, how can we be sure that these are caused by EMF as opposed to other causes? For example, with fertility, somebody's put bisphosphonols. Now, I wonder if I should direct this, given his backgrounds at Leonard Hardell and Ron Melnick, in terms of causation, when we broadly say fertility is declining and we think this is playing a role, there's obviously literature that shows it's playing a role. I think the question is, how do we know how strong that role is? Could you comment?
Well, regarding fertility, we know that there are other factors that are of importance, like the persistent organic pollutants. There are nice studies on, like PCBs and such items, that they can affect male fertility. But now we know that the PCB levels are going down in the population and the fertility problems is going in the other direction. So you can, to some extent, rule out these other issues. But basically, it's very interesting that you find these results in animal studies and, as you mentioned, in human sperm studies. And these are, so to say, clean studies without other environmental exposures. As to epidemiology, you have, of course, other items to look into, which is done in case control studies. So we haven't found actually other risk factors than mobile phones and DECT phones in our studies on gliomas and acoustic neurinoma. We have looked into pesticides and other occupational exposures, and the radio frequency radiation is the one which is coming up in these analyses.
Do you have any comment?
Well, so to rule out other causes, that's why we sometimes begin with animal studies to eliminate any type of confounding. But as we look at the concordance between the human and the animal, it is a remarkable finding when you see that kind of concordance, as well as multiple studies. Leonard Hardell has spoken about the Swedish studies. This came up numerous years ago, and IARC sponsored what was called the Interphone study. This was a multinational study of countries throughout the world, not including the US for some reason. But these studies demonstrated within certain areas there were significant elevations in risk of glioma and acoustic neuroma. And when putting it all together, the Interphone group, it took them years to come to some kind of consensus because there was a lot of arguing in between. Some of the people who were arguing are on the ICNIRP panel. But when you start to see multiple studies, the Interphone showing a statistically significant increase, Dr. Hardell showing numerous times these increases, the concordance with the animals, it can only lead to one conclusion, that it is causal.
Has anyone else got a comment? Yeah. Bring it right up.
I would like to say that our conclusions are based in a combination of epidemiological studies and laboratory studies. For example, for reproductive effects, there are very strong effects in Drosophila, I showed you. There are laboratory studies on human sperm from the Agarwal group, for example, in the States. There are many studies showing reproductive effects, and there are effects on DNA damage with different consequences. When we have DNA damage, many diseases can be explained. Like Professor Pal explained how many different outcomes you can have from DNA damage, for example. And so it's a combination of knowledge. It's not that we don't know. When we know from laboratory studies that this causes, for example, DNA damage, we can explain, and we know that this is not good.
That's a Garrawell study that he just mentioned. For whoever asked about sperm photos, that has some nice bar charts that shows degradation of sperm. So those are the kinds of graphics that are probably more useful.
The studies on fertility are absolutely stunning, and we have, as I listed on my, from animal studies, we know there's impact on the structure of the testis and the structure of the ovaries, and that those develop cumulatively over time. They get worse and worse and worse with times of exposure. Those have been done all in animals. Almost everything else has been done both in humans and in animals, and you have, except for the drop in the number of oocytes, which I think has only been done in animals. But all of the impacts on male fertility, we've got extensive studies on both humans and animals that EMFs cause that. We have extensive studies that the 3 sex hormones drop on exposures, both in humans and in animals. We have extensive studies that we have increases in spontaneous abortion, both in humans and in animals. So, I don't think there should be any question about that. Now, the question that has to be raised, of course, is when you see drops in fertility in human populations, are those caused by EMFs? And I think the simple answer to that is we simply don't have any other hypothesis that explains the vastness of this thing in all these different countries and the extent to which it's occurring. That doesn't mean there isn't any other possibility, but what it means, as I said before, we're taking risks of the sort that no rational society on earth can possibly take.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. And what I can say is that from what I saw in my review in mammalian studies, I saw a lot of effects on these animals regarding the fertility in men, in males in this case. And in particular, a lot of effects related to motility, DNA damage, numbers of spermatids that were lowered due to the effects. And the most important things I want to say is that with the respect of all the other aspects considered in that review, male infertility is the most concordance among the studies. I think about the 90% dependent on the species, if it is mice or rats, are concordant on the fact that radio frequency radiation affects fertility.
It was a brilliant question, and I wanted it close to the beginning because it allows you to see how strong the consensus is on certain issues. So this was a question that I've been asked before. Are millimetre waves going to be used here in the UK? And I had a slide previously for that anyway, which is that there's conflict about this. I'm not sure this mic's working, is it? There's conflict about it and confusion. But my message on this is that given that up to 29 gigahertz, so technically millimetre waves start at 30 to 300 gig. 29 gigahertz, it appears, is up for auction, and then there's dispute about what's being auctioned after that. But there's no magical line at millimetre waves, just to be clear. Using higher frequencies causes a slightly different constellation of potential health effects, but there's not a sort of magical difference where a millimetre wave causes a totally different set to 29 gigahertz. And there are a lot of papers looking at either millimetre waves or these higher frequencies in general. This is a declassified USSR document that was declassified by the CIA and talks in general about millimetre waves, and there are some key points that I've put up there. But what I found fascinating was how we keep talking about skin absorption and how the majority of it's absorbed in skin, and actually there are a whole load of much deeper tissue effects predicted by these papers. But before I move on, I wanted to let my panel add anything to that if they feel there's something they'd like to.
I would like to say that the millimeter waves and the 5G will certainly having a significantly higher carrier frequency in the RF band will certainly cause measurable thermal effects. And this will be in addition to the non-thermal effects described today here. We will have all these important non-thermal effects that we describe, and in addition, we will have thermal effects because the carrier frequency is significantly higher than previous generations of mobile telephony, and the thermal effects, they are proportional to the carrier frequency.
I want to add that this is a very, very important point, and in particular I want to add, because it is not as been stressed enough for me, is that in the immediate future, together with 5G, it will coexist the 4G and the LTE for a lot of years, probably.
I guess I'd like to talk about this issue of penetration. So it's been said that 5G doesn't penetrate well. That's only true of the electrical parts of the millimeter waves. The magnetic parts are vastly penetrating. That's true of other EMFs as well. The magnetic parts are much more penetrating. I think that's how we get deep effects, and there are deep effects that are produced by millimeter waves, as I said in my talk, that are well demonstrated. You can get, when you have these magnetic fields going into the body, what do? They put forces on dissolved ions, and when they do that, they move them. And when they move those dissolved ions, they reconstitute an electrical, the electrical field, and it's same pulsation, same frequencies, just much lower intensities. When you've got the voltage sensor that is extraordinarily sensitive to these EMFs, you can get effects deeply in the body, and those have been demonstrated experimentally. So we need to be clear about this. That doesn't mean you don't have very high surface effects. You do. You get massive surface effects. So both of them are of great concern.
May I have one comment I've been wondering of, and I can't understand really with 5G, and if this technique is used for your mobile phone and you are walking on the street and somebody wants to contact you, how does the base station find you on the street? How is that done? Because we have learned that this is intermittent pulsing effect, and it's not like the older technique, which is have some angle of radiation which is constant. Here is intermittent radiation, and how does this intermittent radiation find the user, the device that should be contacted? I don't know if Christian has an answer, because this has not been shown very well in literature as far as I know. Is there a basic 4G sweeping over the area the whole time or not? You need a mic.
Come up.
Can I speak up?
Come and speak at Brian's mic. Thank you.
According to my information, there will be two steps of implementing 5G. One will be on a 4G backbone, which means that 5G will only be activated whenever necessary, whenever larger amounts of data have to be transferred. And other than that, it'll actually be the 4G network doing all the pilot signals and the structuring of the network as such. And then in a second rollout phase, it'll be 5G, purely 5G, 5G only, standalone 5G, which means that there will be beams which are created on demand, depending on how many users are having a need of stronger radiation per se and a higher bandwidth for data communication. But there will also be a pilot signal which will basically be sweeping really fast in that sector that the antenna is covering. So there will be both. There will be a pilot signal and there will be the beams which are basically then created on demand.
So what does that mean regarding the exposure? I mean, this has not been discussed. To me, it sounds like a larger exposure.
It will definitely be a larger exposure. Every network that comes on top of the other without the first one being deactivated will be an additional exposure, absolutely. And as Dr. Excuse me, I forgot said, the 4G network won't be switched off for quite a while. The 3G network, at least in Germany, will be switched off probably by the end of next year. And those frequencies will then be used for 4G and 5G. And the 2G network won't be switched off for a very long time because there are quite a few examples of usage which are still working on the 2G basis, like bus stations, for example, and all the timetables on the bus stations and those kinds are all based on 2G for the time being.
But is it not correct, as we have heard from authorities, that 5G will only be used when it's in effect, when it needs, and thus the exposure will be much lower? Because what you say contradicts that.
There will be, again, according to everything we know so far, because in Germany it has been rolled out only this much. There are a couple of experimental areas and a couple of streets, a couple of blocks basically where it's active. So it's not the system per se is not known and it's still in development, right? But the 5G will be more energy efficient than previous network systems and network technologies. So there might be a possibility similar to the EcoDect at the DECT cordless phones, if there is literally no one demanding a signal, that there might not be a signal at all, or maybe just very rarely just to check, if there is a demand. And the moment there is a demand, then it will be turned on that basis. So we don't know for sure, but this is what I have been able to gather as information so far.
We don't have much longer in the room, so I'm going to scroll through, but Christian gave a brilliant presentation yesterday about mitigation, and I'm going to ask him to hover by the microphone there, because a later question relates to his subject of expertise also. I'm so happy that somebody asked about insects, and I actually moved the slides out of my talk to quickly show some here, but the question was, are there a big study on insects like the NTP and Ramazzini? And I'm going to let other people answer that, but before I do, I'll just mention a couple of studies that I already had slides about. This one from Arno Thielens, which was published, I think this year, or no, the end of last year, which I think is a really excellent and important study. And some key points from that are about the fact, really, that an insect's body, when you have a whole organism that corresponds to the wavelength of the radiation, then there can be resonance type effects that lead to these very high power absorptions. And there can be up to 300 to 370% greater absorption of power densities as soon as you get above 6 gigahertz. So I like this study because it's important. It's not talking about necessarily things above 30 gigahertz. It's talking about things that we know are planned for deployment with 5G. And explaining that that can cause dielectric heating, which can lead to changes in behaviour, physiology and morphology of pollinators such as bees and other insects. Then there's a study from Alfonso Balmori, which I think is also really important because that is not talking about the higher frequencies necessarily. And Electrosmog and Species Conservation, please do find that paper, which has some similar conclusions in terms of effects on behaviour and navigation, loss of habitat, reproduction, etc., etc. So I'm going to hand over to my colleagues if they have anything more to say about big studies looking at insects.
I don't understand the question, big studies on insects, because when we make experiments with insects, we have groups of many insects. And this cannot be done with mammals, to have so many animals together. But with insects, in its vial I showed you before, we had 20 insects, and we had several groups. So the first paper that was published from my group was in 2004 and was showing 60% reduction of reproductive capacity by 6 minutes exposure for 5 days. I don't think that we really need very big studies of insects. This explains, and later on we saw that this was because of DNA damage. So I think it's all answered, and the decline in bee population, which is very important, a very important phenomenon, it's fully explained because the reproductory system in all insects is very, very similar. Once we have shown DNA damage in Drosophila, we certainly will have DNA damage on bees also.
There were 2 US patents that were approved, one in 2000 and the other in 2001, for using millimeter wave EMFs as insecticides. They are very, very effective. And that's not the highly pulsed 5G. That's just ordinary unpulsed EMFs. They are very, very effective in killing insects.
Thank you so much. This next point, I'm going to ask for a one-sentence answer. We know Christian Blank's views from yesterday that he feels the intensity is going to be very low from satellite radiation and therefore far, perhaps, less noticeable than ground radiation. Is that a fair assessment? But I'll invite other panel members to answer that. Anyone else have a view? So I think the answer is the intensity of satellite radiation will be a lot less, but it's in combination with much higher levels already at ground level. We were told by Dr. Panagopoulos to avoid shielding. What else can we do to protect ourselves? And I'll forward that to Dimitris.
I can't give advice on this. I gave suggestions how to protect ourselves by doing some simple things, by hardwiring internet and not having domestic phones, wireless, of course, by making prudent use of our mobile phones. And so in the case of in very severe cases, when there is a base station antenna in front of our house, then that's why I said I cannot say that I reject shielding in general, but I can certainly say that it will decrease the Schumann oscillations, which are absolutely vital. So find a solution yourselves.
So yesterday we heard from Christian Blank about some of the positive applications of shielding, and I'm going to pose a quick question. Are we having to
I
round
would
up?
like to add something before, sorry.
Yeah,
I would
carry on,
like to-
please.
I would suggest everybody to read my paper of this year, 2019, Shielding Methods and Products Against Man-Made Electromagnetic Fields, Protection versus Risk. We discuss all existing methods of shielding, and we say what is good and what is risky. Basically, most shielding methods are based on metal shielding, all shielding methods, not most, which is not good. But when we have to choose between two risks, we will choose the less risky method, okay? So this is why in this paper we discuss different shielding methods, and we find that, for example, the bed canopy is a shielding bed canopy under certain conditions that we do not have a metallic bed or other metallic inside the bed canopy, would be safer. I would choose this option if I had nothing else to do, because it's for 8 hours a day. It's not a permanent shielding in our house, which is 24 hours. And what is very important, and we suggest in this paper, is urgent experimentation of shielding in combination with Schumann generators.
We're
Can
going to
I
have
just? I hate to argue with the scientist. What I would say is shielding can be used and can be used effectively. It would be silly for you to live in a Faraday cage, because that would then cause problems. But if you've got somebody above you in a flat or at the side of you that is causing a major problem to your health, then I think using shielding in those circumstances can help you if you're electrically sensitive.
It is very much the lesser of two evils in some cases, in that we know from the very important Weaver experiments back in the 70s that shielding Schumann resonance does mess up circadian rhythm. But we also know right here and now that people with AHS are having their circadian rhythm totally reversed by current anthropogenic fields. So, and I have seen cases where, like that, canopies restore circadian rhythm. So it's a temporary measure that can certainly help health, and I would say it would be best for people to do it in emergencies and then move on to find a naturally low EMF space if they possibly can. Will normal clothes protect against 5G, given that it doesn't penetrate well, which I've heard other people ask this question, and I just want to bring your attention to a publication from Om Gandhi, which is actually from the 80s, which points out that clothing can act as an impedance matching transformer, and generally normal clothing when dry will not block higher frequency fields, and that high SARs can be measured through that. And in the same paper, this is looking at higher frequency millimeter type waves, and they point out eye effects as well. These have come up today, but I think these are really important. And they found stromal and epithelial damage to the surface of the rats of the rabbits exposed. Now, this was reversible because they were very acute exposures for short periods of time, but we don't know if that would be reversible if they were exposed for long periods. And do any of my colleagues have anything to say on that? Really quick?
Regarding the protection offered by shielding?
No, this wasn't about shielding. This is about normal clothing, does it?
Normal, not special shielding clothing.
No.
Okay.
And this is more about skin. Is it true they are trying to elevate ICNRP limits to accommodate 5G? And I'm going to let my colleagues comment, and then I have a quick paper to show that I think is relevant.
Yeah, for example, I just want to say that in Italy, where the limits are one of the most safe in Europe and in the world, 6 volt meters, is planned to pass to 61.
Yes, and one comment as that was not me. As I heard from Finland, they plan to increase the exposure to 200 watt per square centimeter, so in a small area. And this will, of course, make problems, because if you have different exposures from different sizes, and they will, I mean, if you have these beam-forming movements, then they can cross each other and you can have a real hot spot. But this is, of course, then they say that 200 watts per square centimeter is much less if you average it over 1 square meter, which is now used by ICNIRP. So then it's no problem, they say in Finland. So we'll see how it ends.
I think, well, I think the answer is yes, for the reasons that you stated. But I think that, again, these do produce penetrating effects. And their argument here is, well, okay, so you heat the skin, maybe we don't worry about it. But that is not what's going on here. That is not, those are not the biological effects. So this is just another egregious, yeah, I guess that's all I want to say.
They increased the ELF magnetic field limit from 1 Gauss to 2 Gauss.
So I also...
Can I just add another comment? Because on the issue of penetration through the skin, we should also remember that the skin is the largest organ in the body. And with exposure, with antennas being clustered very nearby, people outside are going to experience a shorter distance to those antennas. And these are not single exposures, because when you're outside, you're exposed to the sun, and the sun is a cause of melanoma. And the exposures, therefore, that will be realized are 5G frequencies as well as sun. And I would not be surprised to see melanoma rates increase.
I concur, and I've heard other predictions. And I popped in a paper that I think is relevant to this. This is, I think, a really important paper from Ezra Neufeld and Niels Custer. You can find this online, and something really important here is that they've pointed out that because of the way these figures of time are averaged, that even though the exposures are likely to fall within the current ICNIRP guidelines, even below and at that level, the peak-to-average ratio of 1,000 tolerated by ICNIRP may lead to permanent tissue damage, even after short exposures. I believe that was industry. Their history is working with industry, is that right?
Yes, exactly. And I'm amazed that this paper hasn't got any attention, because this is really dangerous if you got permanent tissue damage within the current guidelines.
Yeah. Everyone do find that paper and have a good read of it. This was a group...
Is that the Koosman?
Oh, yeah. Sure. And we don't have much more time left at all. Maybe one more question? So I'll see what was next. Okay, so we have actually covered quite a few of these. This one I think is important, and Dimitris is going to give an answer to this. Is there a safe distance from phone from the head? And the second question was the tower office. But there's something really important that I want Dimitris to tell you in terms of these window effects, intensity windows. A lot of people think, oh, I'll hold my phone about here, because I can still just about hear it, and it's about 20 centimeters from my head. Could you comment, please, Dr. Panagopoulos?
There was a study, one of our studies published in 2010. It studied DNA damage in regards to intensity or distance from the antenna. We exposed different groups from 0 distance up to 1 meter for 6 minutes again. And the intensity of the radiation decreased exponentially and almost got 0, but to 1 meter, but was not 0. If we had more sensitive instruments, we would measure it for several meters. for short-term exposures like 6 minutes that we used, DNA damage started at 1 meter distance, very slightly, and increased as we were approaching the mobile phone, and we had a window between 20 and 30 centimeters where the effect became strongest, even stronger than in zero distance, even a little bit stronger, but almost the same. So the effect is strongest in zero distance, it decreases, and then in 20 centimeters distance, it is a window, and then it decreases after 40 centimeters and goes down. But this was with 2G. The window maybe is displaced by newer mobile phones. In any case, we should never put the mobile phone on our heads. We should, the ways are to use the loudspeaker, put it on the table and talk. If we cannot do this because we don't want the others to hear us, then we use air tube headsets. And most important, we minimize number and duration of calls. And the other tips I gave you, we never sleep with our mobile phones turned on, never.
This one I think is a really good question. If you had to choose one group who was accountable specifically for this issue, who would it be? I invite my panel to comment.
My comment would be ICNIRP and also the WHO EMF radio project.
Okay.
They are linked together, but primarily ICNIRP.
Could everyone hear that all right? I'm sorry, these mics are not easy to pick up, but we'll pick them up and try and move them around. But so Dr. Leonard Hardell's answer to that was he felt ICNIRP was accountable and in conjunction with the WHO. And Ron Melnick's going to
Just
comment.
to add another comment. Within the U.S., I think the FDA, FCC interaction is also critical because they are the regulatory forces within the U.S. But I also agree with ICNIRP, which makes me wonder what that P in ICNIRP stands for, protection of public health or protection of the industry.
A really good point. And in terms of looking a bit more locally like that, because of course ICNIRP have a huge responsibility given that they task themselves with global guideline setting. But I think locally in each country, we do have to look to those groups as well. And so that Public Health England, who are still relying on the AGNE report and have not given any comment on the criticisms made of that report, I think that's really important.
Yeah, I think all the national and international groups that are supposed to be protecting our health have failed, you know, and that's and that is their responsibility, as I understand it.
Well, I would make another comment, and regarding the ICNIRP latest note, which I presented, and this making a dismiss of NTP and Ramazzini findings, they should be tried for medical malpractice, actually.
I just want to mention that Dr. Sarah Starkey, who wrote the AGNE critique, was, you may have seen, previously meant to be speaking today, and she really wanted to be here. There's something else important that she's doing with her work that I entirely support, so I've completely supported her in what she's doing, but that's why I added in some slides about her work, and she's spoken for us before. If you want to hear her talk about her study, she spoke November last year at the FIRE conference, and if you go to YouTube and look up FIRE Medical, we have a YouTube channel where you'll find a whole day's conference last November, and she's describing that report at that time. Now, I think they're still sorting out the questions, but I will find another one. Hang on.
Can I just respond to that?
Oh,
Because
yeah.
although I think that you're absolutely right, they're the people that should be held accountable, I think the reality will be, we'll see over the years, that it's your own fault. Because what is happening now is the government are trying very hard to say, well, schools, you've got to do your own risk assessment, hospitals, you've got to do your own risk assessment, it's down to you to do this. They're trying to cover their own backs.
And what about the politics? They are responsible too. You have to go to the Ministry of Health and Environment as well. Those both ministries are responsible to see the literature objectively. They are doing this subjectively.
This is an interesting question. Are there any sperm photos, was the first bit I could read, I thought, sperm photos, that show the decrease in male fertility? And if so, are they publicly available? And once I understood the question, I tried to look, because I've got a video that was used by C4ST. So whoever wrote that question, if you go to YouTube and look for C4ST, Citizens for Safe Technology, they have a video which I couldn't tell from the video how scientifically this was done. So I did contact that group. Frank Legg runs that group. And I think Magda Harvest was involved in getting that video together. And they're confident that it's valid science. So there's an actual video. And then in some of the publications, they absolutely have photographs of some of the sperm effects. But do any of my panel, can they access those publications in their head?
It's not hard to find them, but I don't think I can do it in my head.
No.
Let me just say, I think that some of the, I mean, you know, there are many studies which have, you know, produced graphical information on this,
Yeah.
which I think are actually much more convincing than a photo, which, you know, you can choose your own photos to look at.
It's more useful to get the bar charts.
And I want to say one thing. You know, when people say, oh, there's no evidence of human effects, some of the best evidence of human effects are actually human sperm studies, where people have taken individual sperm samples, split them in half, irradiate one with cell phone radiation or Wi-Fi radiation, and what do you see? You see a major drop in sperm motility from exposures that we all have. So, you know, this is one example of where we have absolutely superb studies on human effects.
I'm sorry, that's all the questions we have time for. And I'm going to let Mr. Breinstein, CBE, say goodnight to you all.
Can I give a big round of applause to our scientists, please? I'd like to thank again our sponsors, Children with Cancer, via EARS UK and the BSEM for their financial support for helping us with this conference. I'd like to thank particularly Julie Glendenning, Judy Sharp and Gina from the conference centre. Also, I think it's Richard, is it, our technician, who's done a brilliant job. It's the first time I've ever been in a conference and it's all gone okay. But I repeat, most of all to our scientists, but maybe one other comment, most of all, thank you for yourselves being here today. It's wonderful that you've been able to be here and assimilate and take in the amount of information that we've tried to give you. But I have a final comment. We are experiencing a dangerous time in our country, with a political environment where basic facts are disputed, fundamental truth is questioned, lying is normalized, and unethical behavior is ignored, excused, or rewarded. There remains excuses, justification, and a stubborn willingness to those around them to look the other way or even enable the bad behavior. And that comment comes from James Comely in his book about Donald Trump. But it could equally apply to the UK and our Prime Minister at this moment in time, but it definitely applies to what is going on in the EMF debate. And it's because of that that these scientists are under pressure, because there's so many people that are prepared to lie and undermine their science. So once again, hand of applause for our scientists.